Morning. Good morning. Thank you all so much for being here with us in the room and for those of you tuning in online. I'm Lauren Reese, and on behalf of my colleagues at the Wilson Center, it's my privilege to welcome you to today's launch of Dr. Gladys Kalema-Zikusoka's book, Walking with Gorillas, yes. The Journey of an African Wildlife Vet. For those of you joining the Wilson Center for the first time, I'll share a quick word about us. The Wilson Center is a think tank mandated by the U.S. Congress to bridge policy, practice, and research in honor of President Wilson, who was the only president to have a PhD. The center is home to about 20 programs that focus on different regions of the world or topics, including the Maternal Health Initiative and the Africa Program, our partners on today's event. The program I direct, the Environmental Change and Security Program, works to connect issues at the intersection of environment, health, population dynamics, and security to foreign policy and international development. We are just 3 days shy of the 15th anniversary of when the Wilson Center first hosted Dr. Gladys. I don't know if you know that, but so, and as I think many of you know, Dr. Gladys is the founder and CEO of Conservation Through Public Health, an multiple award-winning NGO that protects endangered mountain gorillas and other wildlife through integrated population health and environment approaches. As a trailblazer in integrated development and One Health, Gladys has been a steady source of knowledge and grounded expertise for us here at the Wilson Center. In fact, she was one of the first calls I made in the early days of the pandemic to understand human-to-wildlife transmission of COVID-19 and what that might mean for a whole host of issues. So when she told me she was writing a book, my immediate response was to invite her here to launch it. And I mean, she's like, I'm gonna write this book. And I said, great, we'll see you in 5 to 10 years. No. Like, she just gets it done, right? So I don't know when or how, but she does. So Walking with Gorillas is really a treasure trove of valuable observations and lessons. I started making a list of the kinds of people who I think should read the book as I was reading it. And obviously conservationists, development and public health professionals, Africanists, but also students and young people, teachers, innovators seeking to build something new. Gladys's work is such an important example of what can be achieved through education, network building, and knowledge sharing, of the importance of moving through the world with empathy, appreciating different cultures, listening with openness, and lifting up others who have a shared vision of the future. The book is an incredible, just the number of organizations and institutions and people that she has worked with who have supported her work and whose work she has supported really tells, I think, an important story. She's also honest about the barriers that she's run up against, whether it's being a woman in conservation, having the integrity of projects undermined by burdensome bureaucracies, the physical demands of a wildlife veterinarian, and the sometimes arduous path to building trust with the community. One thing that sets Gladys apart is that when she comes up against a problem, she doesn't just fix the problem, she works with others to build systems and relationships and processes that address the root causes of that problem. So it's such a pleasure to welcome you back to the Wilson Center, Gladys. She's going to kick us off with a presentation of the book. Following that, my colleague Oge Onubogu, director of the Wilson Center's Africa program, will share brief remarks before introducing our discussant, Ambassador Deb Malik, who we're also delighted to be welcoming back to the Wilson Center. We'll have some time for questions towards the end, so for those of you tuning in online, please feel free to submit a question at any point via the website. For those of you in the room, I'll ask you to raise your hand when we get to the Q&A session. So Gladys, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Back. Oops. It's so exciting to be back at the Wilson Center. And thank you all so much for coming for the launch of Walking with Gorillas. Very excited to have the book finally done. And thanks for the wonderful introduction, and I'm glad you've enjoyed reading the book, Lauren. I started writing this book, I would say just before the pandemic, before I knew there was a pandemic. And actually, to look like the pandemic, a lot of people are telling me, you probably got a lot of time to write because of the pandemic. It should have been like that, but actually we didn't because we were extra busy, having championed a One Health approach to conservation before the word One Health was coined. So we were suddenly extremely busy during the pandemic, but somehow managed to keep writing. And this book is divided into 4 parts. So I'm slowly going to go through some highlights in the book. And I'm really looking forward to all your questions. And I really hope you enjoy the presentation and the book. I'll start off by talking about how I became a conservationist. I don't know how old I was when this photo was taken. I was a few months old, and I was on my mother's shoulder. I was the last born in a family of 6, and actually I was born in Mulago Hospital, which is one of the best hospitals in East Africa at the time. And it was an interesting time in Uganda. It was like 1970 when things were still good. Things were still really looking up. And I grew up with lots of pets at home. And I had a family, like I was much younger than all my siblings. So they really treasured me. My dad, who I unfortunately never really got to know, was one of the first, he was a minister in the government that immediately gained independence from the British. So he became a minister in 1964, I think it was. And the President Obote used to like sending him abroad on different missions. So I love this photograph of him when he was in China, leading a delegation in China. Because actually after gaining independence from the British, they went to the east to get resources. So they went to USSR, which is now Russia, Yugoslavia, and countries in the east. And China was one of the big ones, and India as well.
Just give it a minute. I think there's a little bit of a delay.
Okay. Whoops.
That can help advance the slides as well.
Okay. Go back. He also got to be the head of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association in his career in Uganda. And my mom used to accompany him sometimes, and I think they were going to Malta over there. And then on the right is my grandmother. And most people in Uganda live like that. She was holding me. She's my father's mother. He was very close to her and named me after her, my Luganda name, Naluboa. And my mom told me that my grandmother was very brave. She used to chase elephants from her garden. So when we actually moved elephants, she said, maybe those are the same elephants that your grandmother chased from the garden later on. And I was the last born, as I said, in the family of 6. So my sister was 5.5 years older than me. And my elder brother, Kateriga, really liked animals. So he used to like bringing stray cats and dogs home. And I fell in love with them. Unfortunately, this is one of the last photos that was taken when my dad was still alive, because he was one of the first prominent people who was murdered by Idi Amin in 1972, when he came back to Uganda after basically Amin overthrew Uganda when President Obote was in Singapore on a CHOGM, Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. My dad was in the delegation, and then they couldn't fly back to Uganda. They flew to Kenya, stayed to Tanzania, stayed there for some time, and then he came back, and shortly, before a year was over, he was abducted from home. So I never got to know him, but I grew up knowing that my dad wanted to develop Uganda, and I wanted to continue his legacy, like the rest of the family did, and I did it through my passion for wildlife. This photograph is of a vervet monkey. Vervet monkeys are very common in Uganda. They're everywhere. They're not endangered. But this particular monkey taught me a lot and really got me interested in wildlife. He belonged to the Cuban ambassador who lived across from us, and they became good friends with my mother, him and his wife. So they got this pet monkey and they called him Poncho. So Poncho used to like coming home and pulling the cats and dogs' tails, stealing food from the kitchen. He was a very naughty monkey. And one time I was playing the piano and I felt like I wasn't alone. And I saw that Poncho was watching me. So I said, let me see what this monkey can do. So I came out of the room and he sat down on the stool and played one note. And I was like, wow, they're so intelligent. Not only are their fingers like ours and everything, but they're so intelligent. And that's, I think, started my fascination with primates. So at the age of 18, I got the opportunity to revive the Wildlife Club in my high school. in Uganda, Chiwili Secondary School, and we took the students to Queen Elizabeth National Park. It was one of the first 3 national parks in the country. That time we just had very few national parks. And it was a wonderful experience for me because it was my first time to see animals in the wild. But I was disappointed because there were very few animals. And I felt that maybe as a veterinarian, I could help to bring the wildlife back because we were able to walk because there were no predators. There were so few animals that were able to do walking safaris. But it was a turning point in my life that made me feel that I not only want to be a vet, but I want to be a vet who works with wildlife. And then while I was in the wildlife clubs, I got to hear about the mountain gorillas. And I was like, wow, they've just been discovered. And I really wanted to see them. And they said, they're not yet habituated. So it was going to take a while before I could see them. And it was the Bwindi population that was discovered. The Virunga one at the bottom had been obviously discovered in the 50s by Professor George Shala and the late Dr. Diane Fossey, who studied them. So I went to do my vet school in the UK, at the Royal Vet College, University of London. And in the holidays, you're allowed to work with an animal of your choice. So I would come back and I got a chance to work with chimpanzees in Uganda Wildlife Education Center. That time it was just the Entebbe Zoo. In fact, it was called more of an orphanage because the chimpanzees that were taken in and other species were normally animals that were part of the wildlife trafficking. So they would eat the mothers across the border, like in DRC, but the babies were too small to eat, so they would bring them, they'll try and sell them to people. And then they would end up in the center. And the chimps were very intelligent. When you're not looking, they would open the fence and run out. And then you'd have to bring them back in because the cages were quite flimsy. And that was another opportunity to learn about how intelligent they are, but how vulnerable they are and how wildlife trafficking is really detrimental to conservation. Then I got to work with chimpanzees in the wild under Professor Vernon Reynolds. He started the Budongo Forest Project. And it was really fascinating to actually study them in the wild. And I was looking at parasites in their fecal samples. Then later on, I finally got a chance to work with gorillas in Bwindi. And this photograph was actually taken in Bwindi when I went to the waterfall for a walk, because as soon as I got to Bwindi, I couldn't see the gorillas. I got sick. I had a terrible cold. You can imagine. So I wasn't allowed to visit the gorillas. Dr. Liz McPhee, who had been working with Mountain Gorilla Vet Project in Rwanda, was now she was a country director for International Gorilla Conservation Program, and she kind of said to me, you can't see the gorillas, but she introduced me to everyone and they were collecting samples for me. So by the time I finally got to see them, the next slide, when I finally got to see them, I understood how we can easily make them sick. Kachipira was my first mountain gorilla, and that's not a very nice photo, but it's an emotional photo, because when we went to visit this group, he was the only gorilla in the group that day. That time there were only 2 habituated gorilla groups in Bwindi, and only 6 people per gorilla group per day, so maximum of 12 tourists per day could visit the gorillas. Currently now it's much, much more. Like it's 22 gorilla groups and 8 people per group per day. So because there were very few people, we all got to know each other. And I compared gorillas visited by tourists and 2 groups visited by tourists and 1 by researchers. But one thing that fascinated me about Kachipira is he was very accommodating to all of us. I was with a group of tourists and very accommodating. And it made me real and very, very intelligent. And I felt that the gorillas are so vulnerable, they're so few in number, and this made me feel like I want to become a full-time wildlife vet. So collected fecal samples and tested for parasites and bacteria, and actually found that gorillas visited by tourists had more parasites than those visited by researchers. Could have been due to stress. But what also I learned a lot by being at the tourist site of Bwindi is that I understood how tourists were really helping communities to get out of poverty. Because up to that point, there wasn't any other source of employment other than working at the tea factory or being an outgrower for tea. So gorilla tourism was really becoming a significant source of employment, and people were very happy. People who used to be poachers were hired as rangers. We called them born-again poachers. And they made sure this time around the national parks, which became the Wildlife Authority, made sure that most people were hired from the community. Unlike the previous park, like Queen Elizabeth, where they got them from other parts of Uganda, and there was a lot of resentment. And they also were able to set up businesses, sell crafts, accommodation. It was a really wonderful time. So I wrote to the executive director of the Uganda National Parks, Dr. Droma, and I said, I would like to be a vet, and this is what a vet does, because they hadn't had a vet. And he actually wrote back to me and said, we're thinking of hiring a vet, because gorilla tourism had begun, and they were concerned that gorillas could get sick from tourists bringing a fatal flu such as COVID. He said, your job is waiting for you. I was like, what? And then I got cold feet, because I'm like, I'm just in my last year of vet school. I haven't learned about wildlife really. But then later on, I finally went, and within the next year, I started working as Uganda's first wildlife vet. Next slide. But when I got there, I was quite surprised. Most people didn't understand what a vet does, and they were very reluctant for me to treat animals, the biologists I worked with, because they felt, if a warthog is limping, it's the next meal for the lion, which is fine. But if there's disease coming from people, something related to people, snare injuries, disease, something has to be done, especially with a species that was so critically endangered, like the mountain gorillas, which were only around 600 at the time. And so we came up with criteria that they should be human-related, life-threatening. Everybody was concerned about disrupting the natural behavior patterns. And so this was a very interesting time for me, because I had to spend a lot of time educating people what a vet does and why it's important. But the first case we had was a scabies skin disease in the gorillas. When they told me they're developing white scaly skin and losing hair, I asked a human doctor friend of mine, what's the most common skin disease in people? She said it's scabies. And in Uganda, low-income groups of people don't wash their clothes often and don't bathe often, and it's a very common disease. But it's highly preventable. So when we went up to treat the gorillas, we went up with ivermectin, and the vet in the picture there is Dr. Richard Koch. He had come to visit, and he had a consultancy with World Bank to look at the veterinary needs of the Wildlife Authority. And so I was supposed to move with him all around the parks. And I said to him, Richard, let's first go and check on these gorillas which are sick. And he actually told me that cheetahs in Masai Mara had also got sarcoptic mange, but it was those that were visited by very many tourists in vehicles. And he attributed it to stress. So when we got there, this group was now down to 4 gorillas with 6 tourists visiting. That gorilla was scratching even under the effects of ketamine anesthetic. And we treated him with ivermectin, and we happened to be with 2 vets one from St. Louis Zoo, who was visiting as a tourist, the head vet of St. Louis Zoo, Dr. Eric Miller, and his partner, who was a small animal veterinarian. And Richard recognized them in the tourist group, and we invited them to assist. So I had 3 senior vets with me, and we all agreed that it was scabies and treated the group. But the baby gorilla was dropped a few days later, because the next day when we went back to treat them, the mother was very shy and wouldn't allow us near her. And this gorilla was crawling with mites even after having died. So we're able to get a fresh post-mortem and prove that it was scabies. But then we had other cases like a rectal prolapse, and we said, did they pick up a parasite which made the gorilla strain to defecate and end up, having a prolapse? I operated on her, although it was quite controversial because people thought maybe it's bad genes, and we're promoting bad genes in an already endangered population. But when Kahara recovered from the operation, everyone was happy. And she went on to have 6 babies in her lifetime, hopefully, because gorillas can have as many as 6 babies in their lifetime. And so I started realizing that it was difficult to keep the gorillas healthy without improving the health of their human neighbors. That particular farmer had just had his banana crop destroyed by one of the most popular gorilla groups, Mubare Group. And I asked him, do you like gorillas? He said, yes. My children are employed by the park. Some of the money from tourism is shared with the local community to build schools, clinics, and roads. But the individual farmer like me, I'm not being compensated. They came to see tourists in my garden. And look how the tourists came to see gorillas in my garden, and look how they've destroyed it. So he became one of the first members of the human-gorilla conflict team that had gorillas back when they come out. And then everybody pointed to me and said, could you set up a health education program for the community? Being the only vet in the organization with some public health training, I got a chance to set up this program, and it was a turning point in my life, because then I felt we need to improve the health of the people if we're going to keep the gorillas healthy and their habitats secure. And we met with 1,000 people in 8 villages where gorillas are always coming out. And it was my first opportunity to meet with communities, because up to that point I was only just working with the animals. And when I told them what the problem was, we went together with the community conservation warden and ranger and district health assistants. I was about to tell them the solution, and someone touched my hand, the ranger touched my hand and said, let them come up with a solution. And they came up with a much better solution than what I was proposing for them, which was very humbling and enlightening. And they really knew what was best for them. And really they wanted health services to be brought closer. I didn't realize that many of them lived so far away from the nearest health centers. And it was very difficult for them to get any health care. And I also realized that they also talked about strengthening the human-gorilla conflict team that herds gorillas back with gumboots and raincoats, and they said they wanted continuous health education. So we decided to set up an NGO later that looked at this. And all of this was reported. We got a lot of media attention, and because I also needed money for fundraising, and this helped. So we had the film on BBC helped to get a lot of attention and support, and National Geographic. I'm glad that National Geographic is here. I'm now an explorer, and Animal Planet. And this brought a lot of attention. And then a lady was writing a book about women in male-dominated professions, and she wrote one about me, and I was a co-author. That's when we were moving giraffes from Kenya to Uganda, because we had only one female left in Kidepo. And as we speak now, it's gone from 5 to over 50 giraffes. So we're pleased that that translocation really worked. And so having been Uganda's first wildlife vet, I felt that now the vet unit needs to continue beyond me. And I got an opportunity to go to North Carolina and do a zoo medicine residency at the North Carolina State University and North Carolina Zoo. And that's when I got to do more tuberculosis research at the Human Wildlife Livestock Interface. And then we decided to start conservation through public health. Next slide. So that's when my One Health journey really began. My husband is here today. I convinced him to join the NGO, and he was the first donor with $100. As a poor student, a poor master's student. So we started CTPH. And of course, one thing I did recognize is we started it to prevent zoonotic disease transmission, but there were so many things leading to this. Habitat loss was a big one, because once you habituate gorillas for tourism, they lose their fear of people, and then they start to go to places where they used to range before tourism began and before their forest habitat was cut. And it's cut because of high human population densities around the park. And in these parts in Uganda, it's around 300 people per square kilometer around Bwindi. In Rwanda, it's even higher, where the mountain gorillas are found. And then poaching is always an issue everywhere in Africa where wildlife is found. But in Uganda, luckily, people don't eat gorillas because it's bad luck to look in the eyes of a gorilla. The Batwa, who used to live inside the park, the hunter-gatherers, said that they wouldn't look into the eyes of a gorilla, but they would set snares for duiker and bush pig. But if the gorillas crossed to Congo, they were likely to get eaten, because in the rest of Africa, people believe if you eat a gorilla or a chimpanzee, you become as strong as a gorilla or a chimp. So the cultural beliefs were really determining the fate of these animals. So this particular gorilla is one of my favorite gorillas, Kanyonyi, and he was born in '96 when I just started working in Uganda as their first wildlife vet. And he grew up seeing tourists all his life. So when he became the lead silverback of his group, when his dad died, he used to frighten tourists to see their reaction. It's a very naughty gorilla. And now he was big and everybody would freak out. And then he ended up dying of not human-related causes. He fell off a tree, never got better in spite of treatment, and fought with another silverback who wanted to take over the group, and he never recovered. But when I shared his tribute on Facebook, we got over 300 shares. And the community was very sad that he died, and everybody was. So it showed how far conservation efforts had gone. And Conservation Through Public Health was founded in 2003. This year we celebrate 20 years of CTPH. And it's a great way to celebrate it with a book. And inside this forest, you don't only have gorillas, but you have elephants, chimpanzees, over 4 species of monkeys, over 200 species of butterflies, and over 300 species of birds. It's a very important water catchment area and a climate modulator. It's only 321 square kilometers, unfortunately. But if this is the view from our office, you can look all the way from Kanungu district to Kisoro district. And I would invite you all to visit and really enjoy this view and appreciate what it does. But it really helps. We talk to the communities that the forest is good for gorillas, but for water as well. So that's a very important message that comes across. And CTPH has 3 integrated programs: wildlife conservation, community health, and alternative livelihoods. We started the alternative livelihood program when we saw that many people were unhealthy because they're poor. And we trained the rangers to monitor the health of the gorillas, which really helps to know whether they're picking up diseases from people or their livestock. And we built a gorilla research clinic with funding from MacArthur Foundation and other donors. And then later on, it became a bigger center. And in that photograph is former ambassador, Steve Browning, with his wife, Susie. USAID was giving us funding through African Wildlife Foundation, and they came to visit us in the first gorilla research clinic. He actually looked under the microscope as well. And then the second photograph is when we built the bigger center, and we're hosting students from UK and US studying parasites and stress hormones with our third founder member, Stephen Rubanga, who was training them and studying with them. Just click. It's a very short video. So this particular gorilla is moving outside the park. And this is what happens a lot. Once they lose their fear of people, they like to go outside the park to try and raid people's crops. And this happens all the time. This video was just taken a few months ago. So we engage the local communities to also herd gorillas back and to monitor their health when they're outside the park. So we're training the gorilla guardians, human-gorilla conflict team, to herd gorillas back and take samples. And on the right are the women who we work with. We work with community health workers and teach them to do conservation work. In Uganda, they're called village health teams, so we call them village health and conservation teams. They promote good health and hygiene, good sanitation. They also promote, they look out for people who are sick, who could have scabies, TB, HIV, and refer them to the nearest health center. And during the pandemic, they also started looking out for people who could have COVID. They did a lot of work during the pandemic, but they also focus on family planning. And over here is one of the government health centers where we hold group talks and train them to go and do group talks and household visits. The lady over there is Dr. Lynn Gaffikin. She was someone who was a PhD fellow supported by USAID to go to Madagascar to try and promote community-based family planning in biodiversity hotspots. So she was brought on to help us when we got funding from USAID to start a PhD program to add family planning on our model. And as you can see in the previous photo, half our volunteers were men and half were women. It just happened to be like that, which was great, because the local leaders are the ones who selected them. And this lady, Hope, was giving a group talk about what was on the flip chart, looking at the issue of having too many children. Half are going to school, half are to chase wildlife from the garden, as they would say. And, when the gorillas come into their garden, they try and chase them away, and it results in gorillas harming people, people getting hurt, gorillas getting hurt, disease spread happening. And then the good family has 4 children, which is good for Uganda. 4 children, 2 boys, 2 girls, which is quite good. And they all go to school, and when the gorillas come out, they call out the human-gorilla conflict team, and eventually the boy becomes a ranger, the girl becomes a nurse. And that kind of flip chart enables people to rather be the family that has few children than the family that has many and can't cope. And it's really changed behavior. The most popular contraceptive was the Depo-Provera injection. And so Rehema is giving an injection to someone in the comfort of her home. We got support from Family Health International, and this eventually became a national policy in Uganda as one of their pilot sites. And we started to sustain them with group livelihood projects, which was great, because from the beginning they were like, we don't have a salary, how can we keep going? And luckily the funding we got from USAID they were able to enable us to do this. And we haven't had volunteer dropouts for over 16 years now, which is fantastic. 15 years later, Population Connection continued to support us. They've been supporting us all this time. And this photograph I took just a couple of months ago. They're now using Sayana Press. The same volunteers are working with us, and now the numbers have grown to 270. 10 times as many volunteers, reaching 7,000 homes with over 40,000 people, which is amazing. So the numbers of mountain gorillas are steadily increasing. When I participated in the first census in 97, we counted 300 gorillas in Bwindi to add to the 350 in Virunga. And in the last census in 2018, we counted 459 gorillas in Bwindi. So the numbers are steadily going up and almost doubled over the past 25 years. And this is due to a lot of successful conservation efforts, better veterinary care, better community engagement, improved community health. We're finding that as the community is getting more healthy, the gorillas are falling sick less often. And also when you improve the health of people, you show them that you care not only about the gorillas and the forest, but you also care about them, and they're more likely to support conservation. Tourism money is also helping, and that's helped a lot. But we found out that there are some people who are not part of the tourism industry, which was the coffee farmers. When you cross going to trek gorillas, I think, Ambassador, you've been to see. Did you get a chance to cross a coffee farm?
Oh, yes.
And they'll tell you that this is an Arabica tree or a Robusta tree, but you're not able to. But I found out that these farmers weren't getting a steady market or a fair price, and they're still entering the forest to poach. So we worked with the farmers to start to build a global coffee brand to save gorillas. Lawrence, my husband, was like, why don't we just build this brand and find another way to sustain conservation efforts? And as we speak now, actually the first market was in US with John Pangos, and he was an intern at World Wildlife Fund, and then they told him about us, and he was our first distributor. He has just stopped being a distributor and handed over to Valerie, who's here today with Cradle. And then in UK, Manny Robbins came on board during the pandemic when we had very little, there was no market and there was a lot of poaching in the park. And Manny Robbins came on board and they've ordered about 12 times since the pandemic. And that helped to keep some people out of the forest even when there was no money from tourism. Gorilla tourism is one of the premier activities in East Africa, and over here, everybody is following the rules. They're 7 meters away. We did the studies with students in Ohio University and found that 60% of the time, people got too close to gorillas, and they were less than 3 meters. 40% of the time, the gorillas broke the rules. So, and we had to do something about it, especially when the pandemic began. And of course, with all that social distancing, all the panic that was going on, we advocated to the government, we led the effort to make sure that everybody wears masks when they visit the gorillas, whether it's the rangers, the tourists, and this was a very big thing that happened on top of temperature taking. Next slide. And we continued to carry out a lot of education building upon our One Health model. So we did education and testing both the gorillas and the people. We engaged the gorilla guardians and village health and conservation teams, and we were One Health essential workers. That's why I never had as much time to write the book as I would have wanted, because we were extremely busy. And even when it came to vaccination, we advocated for the rangers to be among the priority people to be vaccinated, along with health workers and teachers, and together also with conservation personnel. And then when there was vaccination reluctance amongst the rangers, we had to educate them why it's important. We were completely busy, but they all got vaccinated. And when the community saw they hadn't lost an arm or a leg, then they agreed to be vaccinated as well. But unfortunately, Rafiki, one of the gorillas, was killed by a hungry bushmeat poacher during the pandemic, because poaching really went up, because the economy had really disappeared because of all the lockdowns. And obviously you can see this poacher wasn't hunting the gorilla, he was hunting other meat. But he got into, when the gorilla charged, when he speared the bush pig, because the gorilla wanted to protect his family, ended up killing the gorilla. And he was put in jail for 11 years for killing the gorilla and the dyke and the bush pig, the longest anyone has ever been put in jail. But during this time we met with the women, and as well as the other reform poachers. And the women and the reform poachers brought their wives to the meeting, and the wives told me that they convinced their husbands to get meat when there's no food on the table. So it's so important to engage women as well as men in all these discussions. Next slide. So we decided to provide ready-to-grow, fast-growing seedlings to over 1,000 households, including the poacher's wife. She was only 22 years old, with 3 children under the age of 3, and she lived in a very temporary mud hut, and she was really, really poor. And we made sure that our village health and conservation teams reach her. And when we gave out questionnaires, we distributed questionnaires with the first 1,000 households, and people said they were poaching because they were hungry. So this food security has now become an important component of our One Health model. Responsible tourism. Not only should you wear a mask when you visit the great apes, but you should buy crafts from the community. You should visit community members. Another way we convince community members to get vaccinated is we said, tourists don't want to visit you if you're not vaccinated. The tour operators had told us that because they're worried that they're going to pick up COVID from you. So they all went ahead and got vaccinated. And he was very happy. He was one of the first people to actually receive a visitor after 6 months when I took the German journalist to the gorillas for DWTV. So we launched a policy brief on responsible tourism to great apes there are actually 13 countries in Africa with great apes, 21 countries with great apes, of which 13 have great ape tourism at 33 sites. So we launched it at the IUCN African Protected Area Congress in Rwanda in July. We had 2 operators on there, Praveen from Volcano Safaris and Manzi. We had the Deputy Director of Rwanda Development Board, the Chief Warden of Bwindi, and a lady called Dr. Emmanuel Norman working with chimps in Ivory Coast. And we did it together with the International Gorilla Conservation Program so that all of them know that when you visit tourists, you should wear a mask, maintain the distance, and make sure you meet a community member, because then they won't enter the park to poach. Women in conservation. When I started out, there were no female rangers. The women were only sitting at desks at headquarters or maybe meeting communities, but not going out into the field. And now, the first day that mask wearing was started in Uganda, I traveled with Goretti to do the training. She's a female ranger, highly motivated. And as I speak now, 20% of the rangers are women, and they're doing extremely well, which is very exciting. And we're so glad to be able to engage women in, Hope is now a leader in her community because of our work. We're bringing about gender empowerment through our work, and we're very excited about that. I'm a founder member of the Women for Environment Africa Leadership Council, which was initiated by Dr. Leila Haza, who founded Lion Guardians. And so we're trying to get women to all fulfill their leadership potential. And part of this involves mentoring women, and this was one of our first cohorts. I also want to mention that as part of the policy brief, and I'm really glad to see that Fred is here, we worked with the Africa CSO Biodiversity Alliance, which was basically got together, wanted to strengthen the African voice as part of the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and it was created during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so when I told them the work we're doing in Bwindi, they were like, why don't you write a policy brief? So they launched the policy brief at the APAC conference. And all this is about strengthening African leadership in research and conservation. APS was founded in 2016. I'm a founder member, and I'm the vice president of African Primate Society. The president is from Ivory Coast, Dr. Inza Kone. Because we found that very often when you go to conferences, only 10% of the delegates are from Africa, where the primates are, and the discussions about those African primates. So at this conference that was held in Entebbe, we had 85% were from African countries and giving talks. And we even had people from Nigeria who went back to Nigeria and went on radio and said, we shouldn't eat our primates. In Uganda, they're benefiting from primate tourism. So it's really important to build a homegrown movement. At this conference, we had the Minister of Tourism, Honorable Kamuntu, we had the Japanese ambassador. It was a really great conference, and we really accomplished a lot. And went ahead and published a paper with Dr. Inza Kone. And I'll end off by talking about the STEAM. We're also engaging the youth, 10 to 24-year-old, and we're glad that National Geographic has started funding our programs with the youth as well. And so we're very excited about that. Ambassador Natalie Brown came to Bwindi a few months ago. She She came as a tourist, but she ended up working because everybody was so excited to see her. And she became a big advocate. She went to the gorillas, was so excited to see them. And she was a big advocate for mask wearing. So she tweeted about it, mask up when you visit the gorillas. I took my mom to meet the gorillas in 2000 when she was 70 years old. And that's us, many years ago. And she was someone who didn't want me to see the gorillas because she thought they'll maul me. She was very scared. So when I took her to see them, she was like, oh, they're just gentle vegetarian giants. She's been a big source of support in my life, a very big pillar, and very supportive of my work. She was just a bit scared about me seeing gorillas. But now she knows that they're very safe. She published a book in 2021. She was one of the first female members of parliament in the country, and inspired many women to join politics, actually encouraged them, including she mentored the former Speaker of Parliament and former Vice President. And so she's a female icon in politics in Uganda. And her book is here today for all of you to see, but it was great seeing such a strong female role model in my life. And our sons have been going to the gorillas since they were a few months old. Indigo finally saw them when he turned 15. We spaced them the same as the gorillas. We learned about birth spacing from the gorillas 4.5 years apart. The gorillas and chimps are very good at birth spacing without any contraceptive, because then the older one is able to babysit the younger one and build his own nest. And the lady in there is called Zain Verji. When CNN African Voices came to interview us, she told me in 2014, why don't you write a book? Professor Wangari Maathai wrote, you should. And then our older son Indigo wrote a book, Zookeeper for a Week, when he spent a week at the zoo when he was 13. He wrote it when he was 16, during the pandemic, because he had more time. And it won a Moonbeam Award last year. And then his younger brother, Tendo, wrote an article on COVID and gorillas during at a time when it was there was so much tension about COVID in 2021. And he had been to so many workshops with us, so he had become an expert on COVID. So he wrote that article in the New Vision, the national newspaper, children magazine. I was excited to get an award from United Nations Environment Programme for our One Health approach to conservation, and I really emphasized that we need more local champions because they'd become the big decision makers. They will become the members of parliament who decide whether to cut down trees to plant sugarcane, which is an issue in Uganda right now, with Bugoma Forest Reserve and other reserves, Mabira. And so we need more people like that in parliament who understand the importance of protecting the environment. So very excited to win so many awards over the years, including the Sierra Club Earth Care Award. And I'm excited that Skyhorse Publishing, which is based in America, has published the book. On Tuesday, I was able to speak on Good Day New York for 5 minutes. Everyone tells me that's a lot of time on Fox News. And I was excited that they were happy about, they were excited about the book and gorilla conservation and community health. So we'll forward you the link once it's uploaded. I encourage you to read the book and follow us on social media. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Gladys. If you all could please join me once again in thanking Gladys for a wonderful presentation. Gladys, a few things that I picked from your presentation. You really showed how integrated our whole world is when we talk about that holistic approach. Your project really stands as an example of this work. And now that discussions around localization and improving local ownership of projects, I hope that USAID and others who are championing this call for localization are taking a look at the work that you've been doing in Uganda for all these years, because this is a perfect example of what we should be doing. So once again, my name is Oge Onubogu, and I'm the director of our Africa program here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. For those of you who are not familiar with the Africa program, what we do is that we try to address some of the most critical issues facing U.S.-Africa relations, as well as helping to improve the knowledge of Africa here in the United States. So it's our pleasure to be partnering with our colleagues to host you here today. And I would like to introduce our discussant, who probably needs no introduction to many of you in the room here today. Ambassador Deb Malik is a career diplomat who has almost 40 years of experience in the U.S. Foreign Service. In that time, she served as U.S. Ambassador to Uganda, also served as U.S. Ambassador to Liberia, and has also held several high-level, senior-level positions within the Foreign Service, serving across the African continent and in Asia. I'd encourage you all to please read her bio, and without further ado, Ambassador, I'll turn it to you.
Thank you all for this opportunity to be here today. I won't take a lot of time because I think there's a lot to get to, and I know many of you will have questions for Dr. Gladys, but it's a wonderful opportunity to see her again. I think we were trying to figure out when we last saw each other. I think it was right before I left shortly before I left Uganda in early 2020, so probably 2019, and a lot has happened in the meantime with COVID, and you have continued to be busy throughout. But I would like to say I read the book last week, and in fact it was great airplane reading. But I thought I knew a lot about what you had been up to, but I learned a lot about your story reading the book, and I highly encourage those of you who have not yet read it to please do so. And there's a lot to unpack. There are many tangents, I think, that we could explore related to what you cover in your journey from that small child who imagined being a veterinarian, which I think many of us as children, we like animals, we think this is what we want to do, but actually realizing that dream and then going on to do what many would like to do, which is to be a vet and work with wildlife, is something I think that, is a story in and of itself, just that human story. But the critical piece, I think, is really given where we are today with these challenges that we face as a global community with climate change, pandemics coming off the heels, if you will, of COVID-19. But I was also in Liberia during the Ebola epidemic. So, they seem to be coming more and more frequently, right? So we know those are not going to go away. But really trying to spend a few minutes on this whole concept of One Health and how we are all so interconnected. Oge made a great point that as we look at how we can better intervene as humans to ensure that we take care of one another, take care of our environment, take care of our communities, that we need to remember we can't work in these silos as we do. There's the public health piece over here, really focused on human health. We have, environmental or conservation efforts over here. We have, different ways of approaching things. And how you came to this idea, which seems very intuitively obvious to us now. If you read your book, you talk about what you're doing, that, wait a minute, if the humans are sick in the community who may be interacting with these animals, whether it's a zoonotic transmission from the animals to the humans or vice versa, we don't, why not try to address both things and figuring out how you address that interaction? Again, it seems very obvious, but certainly in what we do in development programs, even on the private side or the philanthropic side in terms of donor support, we tend to come in with that idea and we know we need to fix this problem. We forget that what the unintended consequences are or aren't because we haven't looked at that broader spectrum of interconnectedness. So, I applaud you for for picking this up more quickly than the rest of us did and providing what is essentially a case study on what we can do better. And we do have this talk now about localization, and it is very important but the real piece of that is this community engagement and listening to the community. And so, taking the time not to tell people what they need to do in their community, but to listen to them about what they already know they need, what the problems that they face are, the problems that need to be solved, and asking them how best they might be able to do that. Now, we know that they may not always come up with solutions that are rational or reasonable or doable, but that doesn't make them any less valuable because it can help in a collaborative way to determine what's the best way to get to the end result that we're looking for. And we spend a lot of time talking about it, but it's not really we don't listen. We don't listen well. So I think, as Lauren said, there are many, many groups of people who should read this book and learn from you. And learn from the lessons of CTPH over the years and how successful it is. I had the opportunity to be in Burundi and track the gorillas, and if you haven't done it, you must put it on your bucket list, and you must go and do it responsibly. It's an amazing experience.
I'm not sure I understand.
I'm talking to you, Siri. So something that definitely is worth doing, but I think the important piece in connected with that is to spend the time with the community, to talk to the community members, to hear about how they've benefited, and to hear about the pride in many cases that they bring to the discussion about the importance of the role they play in protecting the gorillas, because they also understand that there's benefit for them. They have better access to health care, better access to education, livelihoods, so that they can ultimately make this progress self-sustaining, because they start to have the tools to create better lives for themselves and their families, which in the end is what it's all about. But one thing I wish you had had more time for in your book, if I may, Dr. Gladys, is how you persuaded the government itself to be invested in this approach. Because I think so often it is, again, donors come in, whether it's a government or a philanthropy, and, say, oh, we want to support this program, we want to do this, but governments themselves have such an important role to play in ensuring the success of interventions, and in fact have a responsibility to be supportive and to provide interventions that will help their own communities. And so I think that would be one thing I'd be very interested in understanding, how easy or how difficult it was to ensure that there was government support for this, because any of these programs, whether it's in Uganda or take your pick across countries, it's very difficult to get them to put skin in the game and make sure that it's an important priority. But I'm going to stop there, because I think we want to hear more from Gladys. You don't want to hear me go on and on about all kinds of things. But I just want to say again, thank you so much for the work that you are doing. It is very, very important, and I hope that, not that I hope, I know you will continue to voice to push us in the direction that we need to go, because what we need is more of these kinds of approaches without going down the path of just assuming we can scale up this particular approach. Because that's, I think, where often projects and good ideas and even successful things that are working at the community level go to die. When people think, well, now we have to do this exact same thing everywhere. And it brings us back to what is the heart of the success of the work that you've done, which is the community involvement, the community ownership, the community solutions, which may not be the same in one community as it is somewhere else, even if some of those conditions may be similar. So,
Yes.
Thank you again. Thanks for the opportunity to be here today, and I look forward to hearing more about it. And please read this book. It's important.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Ambassador. I think that's a really good point. It's not about exactly what they did, but how they did it, maybe, that can be taken forward into similar efforts. So I got permission from Gladys and our AV team to extend our hour to an hour and 15 minutes. So I want to invite you all to stay, but I also understand if you have conflicts, and you will be excused if you need to step out of the room. But we'll have about 15 minutes now for Q&A. We have a few questions that have come in online. I want to, before we get to those, I want to give you an opportunity to maybe respond to the ambassador's point about, or question about how you worked with the government to build that support. And then I'll come to you in the room. So have your questions ready. Go ahead, Gladys.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Deborah. That was for the lovely comments. And I'm glad you enjoyed the book. I would say that, how did we convince the government? I guess being very determined. It helped a lot that I was already a government officer. My very first job was as a government officer, setting up the veterinary department in the Uganda Wildlife Authority. So they already trusted me, I would say. So when I started the NGO, they understood why it was important, because we were now realizing people were making gorillas sick. You know, gorillas would find dirty clothing in gardens, open defecation. So we kind of discovered this One Health issue together. And so when we started the NGO, it was easier for me to work with the government and convince them, because they knew that I was already, part of them. But one thing that I can say is, when I was in the government, NGOs used to come and say, this is what we're doing for you, this is what we're doing for you. The government would say, that's not our priority. I don't even know what this NGO is doing. We don't understand what they're doing. So what we did is, when we got funding from North Carolina Zoo, our very first funding, they said to us, you can do what you want with it. It was $6,000 of unrestricted funding. So we decided that we're going to hold a workshop to launch the NGO, a stakeholder consultation workshop. We invited about 35 people to Ruhija, the research side of Bwindi. We're all camping, it's quite exciting. And we told them that this is what we want to do in our NGO. Tell us how you think we should do it. Because I realized the importance of getting ownership from all the stakeholders from the beginning, and not just saying, this is what you need, we know what's best for you. We actually got input from everyone. And they came up with very interesting things like, you should work with traditional healers. This came from Bara University, which has a very strong community-based healthcare component. There were so many very good suggestions they came up with. How we can do the animal health, human health, and that time it was information, education, and communication, ICT, for development. And so that really helped. So from the very beginning, the person who was a guest of honor was the LC5, Local Council 5, who was represented by the district health officer, Dr. Stephen Sebude, who became a strong pillar of support all through. Unfortunately, he died of COVID, which is very sad. But he was someone who, and we always remember his contribution. He was actually excited. He said to us one day, CTPH, you're doing a great job. Kanungu has the best fertility rate. It went from 7 to 4.1 children per woman, and you had a lot to do with it. We're very excited. That's the area around Bwindi. He was a great advocate for family planning and population health environment. So it's like, I think it was just the way that we engaged them from the very beginning. And then later on, they asked me to serve on their board, which was very exciting, serving on a board where I used to be a staff member. Of course, all the staff were sending me all these requests, but like my former colleagues. One of them was, we need to increase the salary of the rangers, which we doubled, actually. They were very happy, That really made them motivated. But one of the things we also advocated for when I was on the board of UA was to increase the money that the community gets from tourism. It used to be $5 per permit on top of the park entry fee, because there's an act of parliament in Uganda that 20% of the park entry fee has to be shared with the local communities. But in Bwindi, you're only restricted to 8 people per group per day because of the health issues and the behavior issues. And so they can't have as many tourists as Queen Elizabeth National Park or other parks. And so there's the $5 per permit for the levy. A permit is now $700. And so I advocated together with the Uganda Poverty and Conservation Learning Group, which as a part of, we advocated, and it went up to $10 per permit when I was on the board. So I was very happy. So now the community gets a lot more money from gorilla tourism, and that makes them happier as well. So it was actually, I really enjoyed serving on the board because we made a lot of difference. And now I'm still an honorary, honorary wildlife officer, because I served on the board, which means that they still value my advice, and my family can visit the national parks for free for the rest of their lives. And I encourage you all to visit the national parks.
Great, that's great, thank you. I want to acknowledge that Lawrence Zikusoka is here in the room. This is Gladys's husband and features prominently in the book and had a big role in the information, communications, and technology aspect of the work. Do you want to comment quickly on sort of that aspect of CTPH's work? I don't mean to put you on the spot.
I'd rather read the small part of the foreword from Dr. Jane Goodall, if you don't mind.
Yeah, please.
Thank you. So, her story is amazing, and I recommend this book to everyone interested in conservation, alleviating poverty, and the role of women in society. But perhaps most importantly, it is a truly amazing story of how one determined and dedicated woman overcame many setbacks and faced many dangers to follow her dreams. She has made a huge difference to conservation in Uganda, and she is an inspiring example to young and not so young people everywhere. Dr. Jane Goodall, UN Messenger of Peace. Well done, Dr. Gladys.
Thank you, Lawrence.
So why don't we take a round of questions from in the room, and then I'll go to some of the online questions. If you could raise your hand, and when I call on you, please give us your name and your affiliation if you have one. And I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions, so get in line. We'll start over here. And yes, please do use the microphone. You just push the button. Yep.
Thank you. Hi, Gladys. Thank you so much. I feel like I know a lot about you, but I learned so much right now, so I'm really looking forward to read the book.
Thank you, Louisa.
But following on the comment from the ambassador regarding how do we scale this, this model, which is so comprehensive. Do you have are there any plans in Uganda to replicate this model in other areas, in other national parks, in other regions in the country? I know that it's incredibly diverse, and obviously the situations are very different in each place, but kind of like use this as a model from the beginning. It was like how to engage the community, how to engage the local authorities. Do you have people that have come to you to say, hey, how can we replicate this in other, like in Queen Elizabeth, for example, or in other regions in Uganda?
That's a great question. Could you give us your name, too?
Oh, sorry. My name is Luis Arnedo. I work for National Geographic.
Great. Thank you very much. Any other questions in the room? Please.
Hi, my name is Marjorie Macieda, and I'm an independent consultant. I work with various agencies that support young people, and so I'm curious, the work you're doing with young people, you mentioned that you're starting a new program, I guess funded by National Geographic. What are some of the objectives, and what have you found about the state of mind of the young people now, given after the pandemic and climate change? Are they worried? Are they excited? How is their thought process different from their parents? Like, what are you sensing, and how will that direct your program?
Great question. Thank you.
Great. I think I'll start with 2 at a time. Louisa, thanks a lot for that question. And I'd like to thank National Geographic for helping us to scale up to other parishes with the One Health model, which is really helping a lot. And now we've started the model household. The model household, where we look at 12 indicators and see how they change over time. I would say that we did try and implement some of our program in Queen Elizabeth National Park early on in the NGO, which was looking at disease between livestock and wildlife, because they really value their cattle. So working with community animal health workers and calling them community conservation animal health workers. This helped a lot when there was an anthrax outbreak in Queen Elizabeth. They stopped people eating wildlife, hippos that had died of anthrax, and also making sure their cows get vaccinated so that they don't pick up anthrax from the wildlife. So that's helping a lot. But because we feel that we can really have a greater impact focusing on one species, we're not a Wild Wildlife Fund or IUCN. So, our board thought that we should focus on one species. And so what we're doing is we're working with the local partners. So we're in a project, we're working closely with the government, Ministry of Health, Uganda Virus Research Institute is leading the consortium, and also Ministry of Agriculture, the Uganda Wildlife Authority, and Makerere University, and 2 universities in UK and US. And what we're trying to do is we're looking at some diseases at the moment: brucellosis, Rift Valley fever, Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever in 6 landscapes, including Bwindi, Queen Elizabeth, Murchison, Kidepo area, Lake Umburo. And we're trying to look at it in people, wildlife, and livestock. And what we're doing is we're working closely with the government, working closely with the local government officers who are there, the rangers, the village health teams, community animal health workers, everybody. It's a government project, and so we're kind of scaling our model through the government system by training the government. We've also implemented part of the model in Mount Elgon, again working with the local government. We're not setting up an office there, we're just working closely with them. And in Budongo Forest, we did something, the Jane Goodall Institute, working with their vets and community conservation groups to implement the One Health model. And in that area, people actually eat baboons because there's influence from across the border. It's a very multi-ethnic area. So we're training them not to eat baboons, and they can pick up other diseases from baboons as well. So yeah, we're just trying to see how to scale it up. We have a small program in DRC, in Virunga side, and we tried to do something around Maiko National Park with funding from St. Andrew's Prize for the Environment. We tried to do something, but it was during the pandemic, so it made it harder. But we did do a small training there. And we'd love to work with local partners all over Africa, where gorilla habitats are found, or all over. And the policy brief was very exciting because we are able to meet many people also through the ACBA, Africa CSO Biodiversity Platform. We're able to partner with other organizations and APS, African Primate Society, to train them in what we're doing. We really want to scale their approach all over the world.
And the other question was focused on the perspectives of young people and how CTPH is working with young people and what you find in those engagements, and if the sort of thought has evolved over the last 20 or so years.
I would say that the young people around Bwindi, especially the area where we're doing the STEAM project, we're calling it STEAM because we've added art to the STEM. The young people there are very excited about gorillas because they've grown up all their lives knowing that the gorillas are important. They're young enough because gorilla tourism began 30 years ago. This year represents 30 years since gorilla tourism began, which is very exciting. And we're engaging 10 to 24-year-olds. So they've grown up in that culture that gorillas are important. So they're different from their parents. I remember one ranger, older ranger, sadly he died a few months ago. He was one of the first trackers. He told me, I think 2 years ago, that they got tired of arresting him as a poacher, and they just made him a ranger. And so those people, it's very, very different. Actually, even one of our staff used to be a poacher. He's now doing a lot of work in monitoring the health of gorillas. But we find that they're coming up with projects like, a lot of projects to reduce the rubbish in the area, all those kind of projects, recycling, and a lot of innovative ideas that they're coming up with. So we're hoping that the next generation is going to be very different from their parents. But by engaging their parents through our work, it makes it easier for the children to be part of it. So even some of our village health and conservation teams are mentors within the STEAM project.
That's great. I'm going to do one question online, and then I'm afraid we'll have to close. This is from Sam Sellers, who's at USAID. He asks, how can veterinarians better communicate about One Health issues to the general public in order to promote behavior change? What strategies and approaches have worked well for you?
I would say that veterinarians are in a very unique position because our training is very wide. It goes beyond only clinical work. And there's a lot that we can do. One thing we can do is really simplify what we say. I've learned a lot about that. Actually, writing the book was a real... I got excellent editors. The publisher was very good, and the my literary agent, they said, you have to break it down. We don't understand what you're saying. It's too scientific. So that really, really helped. So we really have to break down what we're saying so that everyone can understand and support. National Geographic also helps a lot with storytelling. So one thing that vets can do is that, really simplify what we're saying and reach out to other audiences, because, we should be able to reach out to the medical community, the conservation community, the tourism community, and we can't just do things, you remain in a silo. So I think it's really important.
That's great. Well, that's a good message for everybody, I think, veterinarian or not. Okay, well, I want to invite you to join me in thanking Gladys one more time for her important work.
I wanted to just read one sentence, which I had wanted to read from the book. The Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., a neutral policy forum for addressing global issues through independent research and open discussion, supported us to advocate for our PHA approach in the United States. Our approach to family planning was also supported and celebrated by Population Connection, a grassroots nonprofit that advocates to the US Congress to increase funding for international family planning assistance to the UNFPA, and supports other efforts to stabilize the wild population at a level that can be sustained by Earth's resources. I was invited to speak at a Wilson Center panel with Ken Weiss, an environmental journalist who had visited us in Bwindi and written about our work. Speaking at such an important event really opened the door for us to connect with organizations who are also passionate about the impact of population growth and supporting organizations such as ours who are addressing these issues. Population Connection eventually became an important donor to and support of CTPH. Its president, John Siega, gave me valuable advice about fundraising. Well, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Wilson Center.
No, the Wilson Center's mentioned a few times, and I did a little cheer every time as I was reading the book. Thank you so much, Gladys, for all your many years of incredible work in this space and for your leadership. We'll look forward to hosting you again soon here at the Wilson Center. Thank you, Ambassador Malik, for joining us today and bringing your really important perspective. And Oge, it's just a pleasure to work with you here at the Wilson Center. Thank you all for being with us. The event will be recorded and available online, and we'll have some sort of write-up on New Security Beat eventually too. So thank you very much.